Great to be back. It's been a while. And I want us to return to our series on life skills. But dare I ask, how many of you have been experimenting with the conflict resolution model we talked about? I don't want to ask you to raise your hands. It'll just discourage me. But I want to prompt you to dare to speak the truth into each other's lives and see what kind of progress you make towards true community. And I want to continue to encourage you. Conflict resolution is a commitment. And it's a skill. And we need to start mastering it because we will create plenty of conflict for ourselves, sometimes through our intentional actions, sometimes through our sinful actions, and oftentimes through accidental miscommunication. And conflict will come to us. It'll be dealt to us, again, through sometimes intentional, calculated actions, and sometimes through very sinful actions, and then also through misunderstandings. And we'll want to be able to navigate those as effectively as possible. Today we want to continue on this theme of friendships and interpersonal skills. And really, life is all about relationships. And we could stop right there and just muse on that, just think about that. And even for the most introverted people in this room, life is still all about relationships and how we enter into them, how we maintain them, how we enjoy them, how we reconcile in them. We are made in the image of God, and the longing to be in a relationship is a defining part of our hard wiring. And so we all long for connection. Every one of us. Social scientist and author Brene Brown has observed, when you ask people about love, curiously enough, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about connection, they invariably talk about disconnection and feelings of alienation. And when you ask people about belonging, they tell you about feelings of exclusion. And we all relate to this. Every one of us. And this morning, I could tell you about, and actually I'm going to tell you about some of the friendships that have deeply impacted me, but you're like me, we all can think of those times and those experiences which have galvanized a wall in our memories of disappointment, of betrayals, of rejection, of relationships which have gone awry, unkind, harsh treatment, maybe even abuse, and they mark us. Now, Romans 12 has been a wonderful passage that our chaplain's just read, full of all kinds of very meaningful application that builds bonds that help us connect with each other. I want to take you to a simple phrase, the words of Jesus, brief words, powerful words, words that you all know, but hear them again. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. This, most oft called the golden rule, this commandment, Jesus says, sums up the law and the prophets. It certainly sums up the second commandment. It tells us how we as human beings ought to relate to one another in a harmonious way, in a meaningful way, and in a way that generates delight for us. There are other versions of this golden rule, usually worded in the negative. Jewish Rabbi Hillel said, what is hateful to yourself, do not do to someone else. The book of Tobit from the Apocrypha says, what thou thyself hatest, to no man do. Confucius taught, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. One more example, Greek philosopher Epictetus says, what you avoid suffering yourself, do not inflict on others. And largely these are somewhat selfishly motivated. If you don't want to be stung, don't sting others. Jesus turns this principle on its head, and he words it in the positive. He says, be motivated by selfless motives and express yourself in selfless actions. The way you'd like to be treated, that is how I want you to treat others. Now, this passage doesn't need more explanation, but it does need some application. So for the remainder of our time, I want to talk about some application, some life skills that will help us make this a part. It's constant on our thinking and on our practice and on our relating style, so that we live this out and enjoy the fullness of harmony and the delight of relationships that God so wants us to have. So here's a real simple step. Ask yourself how you'd like to be treated. And I'm brain dead serious. Think about this. Just actually ask yourself the question, how do I want to be treated? And get yourself a pen or open up your laptop and write some things down. Think about this. Make a list. When you go to the grocery store, you make a list. If I've got 3 items, I'll come back with 2. So make yourself a list. And if you were going on vacation, you make yourself a list. If you're going to renovate a kitchen, you're going to make a list. So we're talking about your life and how you relate to other human beings in this world. So think about this. We are educated people, and we're now accountable to that education. Think about this. And so if you're a neighbor, how do you want to be treated as a neighbor? If you're a customer, how do you want to be treated as a customer? Because one day you might be serving customers and clients. And if you're a son or daughter, which we all are at some levels, how do you want to be treated? Because that might inform what kind of parent you become. And if you're an employer or an employee, what kind of employer or what kind of employee do you want to be? Well, how do you want to be treated as an employer or as an employee? And if you're a husband or a wife, how do you want to be treated? See, do you want people to get you? I want people to understand me, or at least try to understand me. And so that should inform how I listen to others. And I want people to respect me. And so that should inform how I treat others with respect. And I want people to forgive me because I mess up. I messed up this way. I mess up every day. Well, we all mess up. And when I mess up, I sure hope that the person that I've disappointed, whether intentionally or accidentally, I hope they show grace back to me. And so maybe that should inform the way I relate to others when they disappoint me. Think about this. Think about this. Write it down. Give some intentional reflection and thought. And ask yourself, how do I want to be treated in the various roles that I find myself in? The second one, equally simple, but profoundly impactful. Find a role model. Find a role model and glean from them until their qualities become who you are. Find someone that you look up to and say, I can learn something from that person. So let me tell you a few stories this morning. Let me just tell you about 3 individuals who have deeply impacted my life, powerfully. And I will use their names. And some of you will even know some of these people. But a person who deeply impacted me was a friend. His name was Will. And we met here in the college when I first came. He and I were both freshmen. Both were from Ontario. And we met, and Will is pure joy. He has a big smile, a big teethy smile, and he has a hearty laugh. And he loves people, and people loved him. The girls particularly loved him. In fact, this was in an era pre-computers. And I typed every one of my assignments myself. I took grade 10 typing. And although I poked away at it, I did he never typed one assignment for himself. And I believe at the time the going rate was about $1 a page if you had someone type your papers. He never paid a nickel because the girls would just kept offering to type his papers. I typed all of my own, which might tell you something about my social life in college. But teachers loved him. Everybody loved him. This was a person who always asked about how you were doing. And he always brought out the best in people, would find himself in student leadership, no surprise. And we would become friends, lifelong friends. And I would be deeply impacted by him. And I trust I impacted him, for such is the nature of friendships. But I can tell you, there are things in how he related with people that I watched and I longed for, because I was much quieter, I was much more reserved, and frankly, I was much less confident. And I don't say that to berate myself, that was reality for me. And I watched him and I said, whoa, he relates to people in such a selfless, outgoing, caring way. I can glean from this. And I did imitate, act like, and emulate certain qualities. I made them my own. But my friend Will impacted my life. As your life is being impacted by your friends today. Let me tell you about a second person. This was my pastor. His name is Jack. And if there's ever a role model that a particularly young pastor should have the opportunity to study under and to learn under and to watch, it would be to have a person like Jack model and mentor for them. When I graduated from here, I continued on my studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, but I would come home every summer, both when I was a student here and when I was in Dallas, and he'd always put me to work. Jack was an extraordinary pastor. I watched him place people first. I watched him make wise decisions around godliness and around integrity. I saw a man who loved life, who loved to laugh, who loved his family, and who loved his flock. He loved his people, even when they did bizarre things. He modeled that for me. Everything he did to the best of his abilities. Now listen to this. He was an extraordinarily gifted person, but he was a master at none. And he could have excelled and been profoundly competent in a number of areas, whether it was communication or counseling or mediation, people skills, preaching. But instead, he elected to be very good at a lot of things. And that's what made him such a good pastor. He was a GP. He was a general practitioner. And everything he did to the best of his ability. And he was a profound role model to me. He placed me in leadership well before I probably should have been placed into leadership, and he believed in me. And so I was not raised in a Christian home, and so I didn't have a lot of exposure to pastors. But when I saw how Jack related to people, I very intentionally determined to learn from this man, and I sought to glean from this man and let his life rub off on mine. I'm not Jack, but I adapted and adopted much of who he is and have practiced similarly so. Third story in this hat trick, third person. My father-in-law, Charles. I met him shortly after I was smitten by his daughter. I did the ever so awkward thing of calling him and asking him if I could take his daughter out. Do guys still do that? We would listen to Bill Gothard. Some of you know who Bill Gothard is. So we just called Charles and will you? And we had an interesting conversation on that occasion, but that launched us into a friendship. And Charles is enormously different from me. He's a completely different personality, completely different person. But I watched a man who just so loved his wife like I've never seen a man love his wife. Always holding her hand, putting his arm around her, complimenting her on her meals, affirming her for her skills as a nurse, blessing her for her mothering relationships. Whatever she did, and he was always engaged in the home, helping in the kitchen, helping with domestic responsibilities. And remember, this is in a generation which was much less inclined to do so, but he was in there, loving her, and continues to for now some 67, 68 years. Here's why it was so profound. I never saw my father take my mother's hand. I never saw my father help my mother with anything. Now, my father garnered all kinds of respect from me, and I learned so much from him. And I'm grateful for so much that I embraced from what he gave to me. But he did not know how to love his wife. He did not know how to love his children. And thus, I learned nothing from the home I grew up in. But from Charles Wells, I learned how someone should treat their wife. And that had an enormous impact on me. Today, I've been married to my best friend for 32 years, and I'm grateful for the relationship that I enjoy with her, largely because of recognizing the deficiencies in my life and learning from Will and Jack and certainly Charles. Now, let me say this again. I am not Will. If you meet Will, you'll see I'm not Will. And I'm not Jack. And I'm not Charles. I'm Michael. But I learned from these people. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, imitate me. And Paul says again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And Luke chapter 6, verse 40, Jesus says, when a student is fully developed, when a student is fully equipped, they will be like their teacher. Curiously enough, and I don't want to focus on this too much, but he doesn't say they'll know what their teacher knows. He says they'll be like their teacher. This is what discipleship is all about. It's not knowledge and knowledge, it's life on life. And knowledge is a part of it, content's certainly a part of it, but it's life on life. And every one of us has been gifted in this context to have the opportunity of friendships and community and role modeling. So look around. The friends you have, the staff and faculty that you have here, these are gifts for us, and they are role models for us. And so as we have the humility of mind to explore our blind spots, to identify those areas where, well, I need some help here. Let's ask ourselves, how do I want to be treated in life? And then begin to determine that I'm going to treat people that same way. But then put some flesh on it. Find a role model and garner whatever you can from them. And through habit, through repetition, you practice it until it becomes who you are. And thus we fulfill the golden rule of life. Father in heaven, these simple words of Jesus, they are so infinitely profound. And it is a curious thing how the very thing we long for is the very thing we so often self-destruct in. The blood of Adam continues to pump through our veins. It's marred us, it's bent us, it's distorted us. And we need to think differently, we need to behave differently. Would you help us to appropriate the words of Jesus in our lives? Grant that we would treat others the way we really want to be treated. And would you gift us with role models? Would you help us to see those role models around us? And whether we tell them we're following them or not, would you help us to glean from them in ways that we become more whole, more healthy, that we enjoy the gift of human relationships and connection. We become more like Jesus. This we pray in his name, who was the perfect role model. Amen.